he's a stuff which is making many people confused. Narishkin, you know exactly who the person is. Narishkin.
Yes,
Nourishkin, yes. Says that Poland seeks to occupy part of Ukraine and is willing to step in with its peacekeepers, double quote, in some part of Ukraine, but trying not to be in contact with Russian forces. So, and exactly I wrote it down. Well, and what do you think about this? About this? And you mentioned talking at Jeff's show that Polish attempt to enter Ukraine would be a suicidal mission, which wouldn't be covered by Article 4 or 5. And most likely none of NATO countries would do anything to protect Poland or Polish forces, which would be on Ukrainian territory from the fatal defeat. But anyway, why Narishkin still thinks it's an issue?
Well, probably because he's the head of intelligence and he's receiving information that indicates it's still an issue. I mean, and let me also note that oftentimes in the intelligence business, and I don't pretend to speak on behalf of Mr. Nourishkin or the Russian intelligence services because they have their ways of doing things and etc. But in my experience, when senior intelligence officials are speaking about something in public, it's not the most sensitive intelligence because they wouldn't be talking about it. And B, they're speaking because they want to achieve an outcome. They're putting information out there to do something, to achieve an outcome. An intelligence officer doesn't go before the public and release classified information just for the sake of releasing classified information. It's not his job to make you and I feel we're informed. If he's going to do this, it's because he's been directed by a higher authority, the president, to release information for the objective of trying to shape a situation on the ground. And so my guess is that there has been what we would call chatter in the West, phone calls of a nature that didn't require, for instance, again, this is just hypothetical, but let's say that the SVR, the Russian intelligence services, was able to come in and tap the phone of the Polish president, prime minister. You would never release intelligence derived from that source because that source is so sensitive you just don't want to give it up. So chatter is what happens when people far removed from the center of power are making phone calls that are easily intercepted, et cetera. That's chatter. So if you release something derived from that, it's very difficult to reverse engineer the statement back to the specific source. And it doesn't matter even if it did, because if person X23 stopped talking to person T32, it's not the end of the world. So my guess is it's this kind of information, chatter, that indicates that people are discussing something. And so by coming out and publicizing this, the idea is to get the senior Polish authorities to tamp down and say, no, we're not going. They want an outcome. And the outcome, I think, is to get the Polish government to say, we're not going to do this because the Russians are aware of it and we're not going to get away with this. And the practicalities of it, peacekeeping. In order for there to be peacekeeping, both sides have to want peace. They have to respect the status of peacekeeping forces. If one side, let's call it the Russians, doesn't respect the status of the peacekeeping forces, they're no longer keeping the peace, they're fighting a war. They're war fighters. So Poland can't come in and unilaterally, anoint a Polish armor division as a peacekeeping force. If they're not respected as such by the Russians, they are a Polish armor division that has invaded Ukraine. Now, there's another voice in here that has to be considered as well, and that is of President Lukashenko of Belarus. Mm-hmm. He's made it clear that he will not tolerate, that he views as an existential threat, any concept of Poland extending its contact with Belarus to the southern borders through Western Ukraine to the south, that will not be an acceptable thing. And so the feeling I got from listening to him is that while he is not inclined to put Belarusian forces into Ukraine, he will support the Russian special military operation as he has done, but Belarusian forces won't cross into Ukraine, that this would change if Poland were to intervene. And then we have to understand that the Russians have said straight up, they won't, Polish troops coming into Western Ukraine as peacekeepers. There's an old saying that goes back to the Middle East, but when a camel is outside the tent and they stick their nose in, once the camel's nose is in the tent, it won't stop until the whole camel is in the tent. And so from the Russian perspective, a Polish peacekeeping force is the nose of the NATO camel. And if you allow that to stay there, NATO will end up in Ukraine. That's a 100% outcome.
That's what they were talking about Donbass back in 2014. What? Peacekeepers? Haha, tell us about it. We know who those peacekeepers would turn into exactly.
Yeah. So I think that Narushkin is Mr. Narushkin. I don't mean to be disrespectful. Is playing, not playing. Playing's the wrong word, but he's conducting a diplomatic game. And by game, I mean, it's a chess match. You're putting moving pieces. And so what he's done is he's taken, Queen's bishop to King's. He's made a move, and now we'll see how Poland responds, and how NATO responds. Because remember, the move is being made not just for a Polish audience, but for a NATO audience. Because NATO is going to sit there and go, Poland, if you go in there, if we haven't convened an Article 4 hearing where we've given you NATO blessing, you're going in naked, and if you get attacked, we can't come to your assistance, because we're not going to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. There's a wild card in here too. Zelensky went to Poland, I believe, recently, and there was talk about somehow erasing the border between Ukraine and Poland. And
you're coming to the question I wanted to ask you right away. So please go on.
I'll let you ask the question then. I'll let you ask the question.
No. This is exactly the question about this talk of Zelensky Duda, that the confederation of Ukraine, or what left of Ukraine after special operation has ended, is sooner or later, or in some foreseeable future, is absolutely real. And we're starting to answer that question. I'm really sorry I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. The problem with that thinking, let's talk about international law. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm sure in your audience there's people who are international lawyers who are going, this will be interesting. That's what Major has to say about international law. Yeah. But so forgive me if I get it wrong. But my understanding is example, Article 5 protection under the treaty, the NATO Charter. An attack against one is an attack against all. One of the reasons why NATO doesn't allow nations that are in conflict to join NATO is that by doing so, they inherit that conflict. Therefore, NATO will automatically find itself at war. So they've drawn a red line that says you must have all of your issues resolved before you join. So you join with a clean slate. So Ukraine is a nation in conflict. And Poland has to understand that the stability and peaceful status enjoyed by Poland does not transfer to Ukraine if such a confederation is made during war, but rather the conflict of Ukraine transfers to Poland. And that's an absolute. If Poland and Ukraine were to create this union, first of all, it redefines Poland's status. And there are many in NATO who would say Article 5 no longer applies because Poland has done something unilaterally without the permission of NATO, without the concurrence of NATO. NATO is a consensus-driven organization. So therefore, well, Poland will inherit the conflict. That's the point I'm trying to make. Ukraine doesn't inherit the peace. Poland inherits the conflict. And NATO needs to weigh in. So I think that's why Mr. Nourish is talking about this, because he's trying to remind everybody, all parties involved, that this is not going to go the way Poland and Ukraine think it's going to go. Just because the Polish president and the Ukrainian president have sat down and done something on the maps, it doesn't change the basic principles of international law, which is Poland is a nation in conflict. That conflict will transfer to any nation that seeks to attach itself to Poland politically or militarily. This is why nobody in NATO wants to be called a direct party to the conflict, because that automatically, even though they are direct parties to the conflict, they don't want to be labeled as such, because that changes the scope and scale of the conflict. So I think that's what Nourish is doing, is trying to put a marker on the table that we know what you're doing, we know what you're talking about, and the consequences of that would be dire.
And as far as I understand their talk, the key phrase was, after the special military operation is over, Ukraine and Poland will be confederated. And this is a theater of absurd, because, leftovers with Poland. So we are talking about the Belarus, which doesn't want it. Again, another conflict, another collision? No. Or you mean that you will recapture all the territories up to the border before February 2022? So this is an absurd too. So I don't know, maybe they are playing some strange play, some staging some things to, I don't know for whom, for Ukrainian, maybe for Ukrainian population, maybe for Europe to say we are fine, we are on track of winning and so on and so forth. But this is an absurd. And
I'll just throw one thing out there, though, that could complicate this more. Because what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I don't know if the Russians have that phrase, but
say that again.
What's good for the goose is good for the gander, meaning if you can do it, I get to do it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one could make the case that in Western Ukraine, the majority of the population, if given the choice of self-determination, might opt to break away from a post-conflict Ukraine and join with Poland. If there were a referendum held, there's a good chance that rather than live under Russian domination, they would opt to align with Poland. And this is going to be a tough one for Russia to navigate, because you can't hold a referendum in Crimea, you can't hold a referendum in Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk, and then demand that the world respect this referendum, and then say, but no, Western Ukraine, you cannot have a referendum.
Yeah.
And if I were the Poles and I were the Western Ukrainians, that would be the direction I would be heading. I wouldn't be making any talk about peacekeepers. I wouldn't be talking about military force. I would confront Russia with the political problem of self-determination. Because now Russia has already initiated the process of breaking up Ukraine and absorbing territories through referendum based upon the principles of self-determination. So if the Ukrainians and the Poles went that direction, avoided the potential military conflict, and spoke purely about this, this would lead to more difficulties too, because I think then in Transcarpathia, you'd see the Hungarian element be absorbed by Hungary. You'd be seeing the dismantlement of Ukraine, which is the last thing post-World War II Europe ever wanted. They wanted borders to be permanent, borders to be forever. You don't change them, because once you allow borders to be redrawn, you create the demon of territorial conquest that leads to. I'm just saying it's too late for the issue of borders being permanent. It is what it is, but Poland has to understand it's a double-edged sword, because I guess there's not a significant German population in Silesia anymore, but again, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if Poland has greedy eyes towards Western Ukraine, there might be some Germans who have greedy eyes towards Prussia, Silesia, and the territories that were given to Poland at the end of the Second World War. So it's in Germany, maybe looking to Alsace-Lorraine and some French territories, and Italy might be examining the French Riviera, and the French Riviera might be examining the Italian Riviera, and everybody's going to be looking, and we're all back to square one again. So it's a very dangerous situation. The Poles would probably be well advised just to cease and desist, not to get into this game, this nationalist game, because it's not going to end well for anybody.
Absolutely.